If there's one person in history who divides opinion like no one else, it's this man, Thomas Cromwell. As King Henry VIII's right-hand man, he changed Britain forever. Severing contact with the Pope to make the king head of the church, plundering monasteries, and even conspiring to execute Anne Boleyn. I'm historian Tracy Borman. In this series, I'm exploring the rise and fall of Thomas Cromwell. He came from nowhere, making enemies of the aristocracy to become Henry VIII's henchman. I think it's fair to say I'm pretty much obsessed with Thomas Cromwell. I have a copy of his portrait in my house. I even named my dog after him. And that might seem a bit strange because he's gone down in history as this great scheming villain. But actually, I think a lot of that reputation is down to this painting. He's staring straight ahead. He looks quite menacing. But I don't think that's the case. I think Cromwell wanted to be shown where he so often was, at work on the King's service. This is Cromwell at the peak of his powers. And it's how he wanted to be seen. What I really want to do in this series is to find out what made him seek his fortune, better himself. What was it driving him on? Was it just the lure of power, or was there something else behind it? To find out, I'm drawing on brand new evidence. How was the information gathered? That shows how Cromwell edited documents to keep favour with the king.
Really see very clearly the edge here.
And I'll examine how he took back control of the church in England.
The name of the Pope had to be removed.
Oh yes, it's crossed out.
And replaced by Rex Henry.
I'm following in Cromwell's footsteps to investigate his rise and fall, to discover how his brilliance revolutionised the conventions and norms of the Tudor world. Thomas Cromwell was born around 1485 here in Putney on the banks of the River Thames. Today, it's an affluent London suburb, but back then it was a bustling but rather shabby village. Well, this isn't the most remarkable of London streets. It'd be quite easy to miss it altogether, but actually it's very historic. Brewhouse Lane has been here for over 500 years and was the birthplace of Thomas Cromwell. Brewhouse Lane leads down to the Thames, where back then there was a ferry across the river. Which was particularly important because the only bridge was London Bridge, and that was some 8 miles in that direction. So as you can imagine, the Putney ferry did an absolutely roaring trade. Thomas Cromwell's father, Walter, was a jack of all trades. He was a blacksmith, he owned a fulling mill which processed wool, and he was also an innkeeper. Walter's Inn was called the Anchor, and today a pub still stands on its site. Now, he would have been incredibly well known in the local area because as well as owning all of these businesses, he was also something of a disreputable character, forever in trouble with the law. I have here a copy of local court records. So you can see the word Putney there, and if you read along this line, you come to the name Walter Cromwell. This is just one of many accounts, in fact 48 occasions when he was fined for watering down the beer that he sold, which was seen as quite a heinous crime in the Tudor period. But he was also fined for assaulting and drawing blood from a local man, so he seems to have been quite a violent character as well. Eventually, he was evicted from his home after falsely and fraudulently altering his tenancy documents. There is some suggestion that Cromwell was a bit of a chip off the old block. He himself later described how he was a ruffian in his younger days. And his enemy, Chapuis, really enhanced this and described him as ill-behaved when young, and even claimed that Cromwell landed himself in prison.
Nothing in his early life suggested that he would ever stray far from home. But instead, he did something dangerous that would catapult him from the familiar streets of Putney and transform his life. In 1503, he sailed to the Netherlands, then travelled south to France, a journey that would have taken weeks. France was at war with Spain, so he joined the French army as a soldier on an expedition to Italy. Maybe he was inspired by tales of mercenaries who'd made their fortunes fighting overseas. But if he thought this was a path to riches, he was to be sorely disappointed. His army gathered by the Garigliano River north of Naples. Depleted by sickness, they were no match for the Spanish infantry, and they surrendered. Cromwell escaped, penniless and far from home. But rather than return to England a failure, he headed to one of the most exciting cities in Europe. Florence was just the place to open a young man's eyes. The Renaissance was in full flow, and Raphael, Michelangelo and Leonardo were all creating masterpieces.
Cromwell was pretty much down and out, but he persuaded a wealthy merchant named Francesco Frescobaldi to take him in. And this is the first indication of his remarkable ability to win favour with members of the elite.
Cromwell began working for Frescobaldi as an apprentice merchant, learning to speak Italian and the art of negotiation while making friends in Florentine society. Jonathan Powell was Tony Blair's chief of staff, and he studied the politics of Florence during the Renaissance.
I think Florence in particular was a very exciting city. You'd had these wonderful painters, amazing libraries, the bankers who were there, who he later stayed in touch with, who actually were really the first bankers in Europe and started modern business in some ways. So for him it must have felt like a revolutionary place, a place full of ideas that in some ways he must have imported into Britain.
I think it's hard to imagine him going on to what he achieved if he'd gone straight from his father's forge in Putney.
Yes, if he'd stayed up on Putney Heath in the forge, then I don't think he would have had these ideas. He wouldn't have been able to break out of this prison of the old idealistic thinking based on Christianity and into a modern world of practicalities.
Thomas Cromwell was in Florence at a unique moment. It was here that a book was written that would influence politics for the next 500 years. Its author was Niccolo Machiavelli.
I think the thing that makes Machiavelli special is that he's a realist. He wrote about what he observed, and he wrote about what happens with human nature, and human nature is fairly timeless.
And yet he's had a bad press, hasn't he? He's seen as this kind of arch schemer. The word Machiavellian is almost an insult, isn't it?
Well, it is regarded as an insult. People think of someone like Peter Mandelson as Machiavellian, for example, in modern politics. I think that started right from the beginning. In fact, Shakespeare had Machiavelli as a sort of evil character, so I think he was stuck with that, regardless of how we should actually see him.
Florence was a cauldron of feuds, intrigue and power struggles, and Machiavelli was at the heart of it.
Could you share with me some of Machiavelli's top tips, as it were, for getting on?
Well, what's so interesting is many of the lessons that Machiavelli derived still apply today. For example, he says that, is it better to be loved rather than feared, or vice versa? And the answer is that one would prefer to be both, but since they don't go together readily, if you have to choose, it's much safer to be feared than loved. And that's a lesson that certainly applied then in Italy during all of those wars, but also applies to our modern politics.
It's quite a brutal lesson, isn't it?
It is brutal, but he's right about it, because he says that love is a mutual thing. The people can stop loving the prince, but they can't stop fearing him. That's a one-way thing. So you're much safer if you rely on fear rather than love. It's possible to have both, but if you can't, go for fear.
After about 9 years in Europe, Cromwell returned home, where a new king, Henry VIII, was on the throne. Cromwell was no longer a Putney ruffian. He spoke foreign languages, had worked for powerful men, and had contacts, not just in Florence, but with bankers and merchants across Europe.
His years on the continent had transformed him from a poorly educated, precocious and streetwise ruffian into a cultured, well-connected and successful man of business.
In 1515, aged 30, he married Elizabeth Williams, a wealthy widow whose father had served Henry VII. So she had both money and a royal connection. Together they had 3 children, Alice, Grace and Gregory. For a boy born on the wrong side of the tracks, he'd done well. But on the horizon was a job so big that to succeed he'd have to draw on the Machiavellian skills he'd learned in Italy. Taking it on was an enormous risk. Failure could cost him everything. By his early 30s, Thomas Cromwell was one of London's top lawyers and merchants. But he wanted more. Then an opportunity fell into his lap. It centred around a small town 100 miles north of London, Boston in Lincolnshire. This is St Botolph's Church, known locally as Boston Stump, and it's one of the grandest parish churches in England. I'm meeting local historian Alison Fairman to find out how it became so wealthy.
This is the St Mary's Guild Chapel, which still exists in the form that it probably had in those days.
The Guild of St Mary's had become rich on the back of the wool trade, but it had another major source of income, selling what were known as indulgences.
An indulgence was the stairway to heaven. It was the way of getting up to heaven without passing through purgatory.
I love the fact that you can be as bad as you like here on earth and you still get a fast-track ticket up to heaven.
I think you're right, and people believed it in those days. They were taught that by the priests in a church like this, that if you paid that little bit of money for an indulgence from the Pope, that was the important thing, he would wipe out your sins and let you whiz straight up to heaven.
The Guild was licensed to sell its money-spinning indulgences through a contract with the Pope. But in 1517, this licence was about to expire.
So one of the Guild people went off to get Thomas Cromwell to go to Rome to see the Pope. He knew Italy, he spoke Italian. I expect there weren't that many people in those days that could do that.
So if you want something doing, Mr. Cromwell is your man, even back then.
Absolutely.
With his Machiavellian skills in negotiation and politics learned in Italy, Cromwell had been headhunted as the perfect man to lead the delegation.
So we have here the Guild accounts for Boston, which you can see at the top there.
And they reveal something really interesting, how much the whole operation cost.
And it details that they pay Cromwell £47,
which doesn't sound much today, but actually the equivalent in modern money is £28,000. And then further on, it reveals that the full trip to Rome cost £1,200, which is the same today as £450,000. That's a huge sum that the Guild is laying out on this, and it's Cromwell's job to make sure it's worth it. The pressure was on Cromwell to prove himself. In 1517, he headed back to Italy, where he sought an audience with Pope Leo X. He had to return with a contract for Boston to continue selling indulgences.
getting to Rome was only half the battle, because once there, Cromwell had to be granted an audience with the Pope, and he knew that that could take months. So he devised another tactic, and this was Cromwell's genius. He always found out what made men tick. And in the Pope's case, he loved hunting in the woods. He had a very sweet tooth, and he loved English music. So Cromwell somehow managed to find himself some English singers. He took them into the middle of the woods where he knew the Pope was going to be hunting. And there's a lovely account by John Fox of what happened next. When he sees the Pope approaching, Cromwell steps forward, and having knowledge
of how the Pope's holy tooth greatly delighted in newfangled strange delicates and dainty dishes, it came to his mind to prepare certain fine dishes of jelly.
the Pope is so astonished, he suddenly marvels at the strangeness of the singing and this plate of sweets being presented to him by this strange Englishman. And it works a charm. He gives Cromwell and the Guild everything he came for.
Cromwell had exceeded all expectations. The Pope renewed the lucrative contract, allowing Boston to continue selling indulgences.
I have a copy here listing all the various grants and privileges that were secured, and the key one is here regarding that crucial and very profitable sale of indulgences.
So the souls in purgatory shall enjoy full remission and be released of all their pains.
Well, this was a dazzling success for Boston, securing all of the profitable indulgences that they needed. And it must have given Cromwell a huge amount of confidence, because he dealt with the Pope himself. You don't get much higher authorities than that. So surely he would have returned to England with a newfound swagger.
Back in England, his CV bolstered, Cromwell was now on the lookout for a top job. He didn't have to wait long. He was headhunted by none other than King Henry VIII's special advisor, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. Wolsey's palace was Hampton Court, where he kept a household to rival the king's. Like Cromwell, Wolsey was the son of an innkeeper, and their shared upbringing gave them a special bond. For the ambitious Cromwell, working for Wolsey brought him one step closer to the seat of all power, Henry VIII.
Well, can you imagine what it must have been like for Cromwell? This is all a very far cry from his father's forge in Putney, the splendour of palaces such as Hampton Court. It was enough to overawe even those who'd been born to expect this kind of thing. And Cromwell was very far from that. And yet, he seems to have had such confidence, such belief, that he took it all in his stride. The two men were really like peas in a pod, both of lowly birth, both exceptionally talented, self-made men. Wolsey had risen to become the most powerful man in all England, next to Henry VIII, and Cromwell watched and learned.
Cromwell was soon put to work on a project close to the Cardinal's heart. Wolsey had benefited from an Oxford education, and he wanted other boys from poor backgrounds to get the same opportunities. So he decided to set up 2 colleges of his own. The plans were extravagant, so he had to find a way of funding them. The richest landowner in England wasn't the king or even the nobility. It was the church, and it was here that Wolsey looked to find the money.
Wolsey got permission from the Pope to shut down and sell off 30 small religious houses.
Diverting revenue from monasteries to building projects wasn't a new idea, but it had never been attempted on this scale before.
Cromwell's task was to survey the monasteries that were to be dissolved to fund Wolsey's new college. Well, it was an incredibly complicated task, but he performed it with meticulous care.
He made inventories of the monastery's treasures before stripping them of their furnishings and riches and selling or leasing their lands. A chronicler noted,
This Cromwell was so diligent that he managed to inquire into everything.
And the result was this: Cardinal Wolsey's magnificent new Christ Church College in Oxford.
500 years on, the college still bears the marks of its creator.
It's incredible to see the man himself there overlooking this magnificent courtyard. You can see him with his hand raised. He's wearing his cardinal's hat. You can see his name inscribed in the stonework just below. This is clearly something of which he was extremely proud, and he wanted to make sure that everybody knew whose college it was.
Wolsey was so impressed by Cromwell's work in dissolving the monasteries that he promoted him, praising his good, discreet advice and counsel.
As well as rising to become Wolsey's principal advisor, this also gave Cromwell something of a taste for dissolving monasteries, and I just wonder if it planted a seed for his future career. It certainly made him realise just how much wealth there was to be gained from it.
Wolsey paid Cromwell handsomely for his work, and in 1522 he moved to the heart of the city of London. Austin Friars was once a large monastery centred around a church. It's long gone, but the street plan remains.
Shall we walk through the gateway
Absolutely.
into Austin Friars?
Let's follow in Cromwell's footsteps.
Dr. Nick Holder has surveyed the exact layout of Cromwell's home.
This is the medieval archway into the Friary of Austin Friars. London outside is busy, bustling, narrow streets. Once we get through those gates, we're into a quieter, gated community of the monastery.
There were houses here too.
Yes, the friars can make a bit of money by renting out houses.
Which one was Cromwell's?
Cromwell's one was this white one here. Yours for £4 a year rent.
A bargain. And what have you managed to find out about what Cromwell's house looked like?
It was a 3-storey house, almost certainly built in brick. An entrance into a yard there. Behind us here we have his parlour. We have a new parlour here, small little cellar for the beer and the wine.
Because he was known for his hospitality, wasn't he?
He was known for it, yeah. So here's the kitchen where the stuff is prepared, yeah, and then the hall for more formal dining.
So he's clearly a man on the way up. I mean, it's quite a prestigious address, really.
I think it is a prestigious address, so the prior isn't renting this to, you know, any old person. It has to be the kind of right kind of person.
The boy from Putney had risen far. But trouble was looming, and it would come from the most dangerous source in Tudor England. Henry VIII himself. By 1527, Thomas Cromwell was in his early 40s. The blacksmith's son was now the right-hand man of King Henry VIII's chief fixer, Cardinal Wolsey. Wolsey controlled almost all matters of state, but the Tudor world was full of intrigue, and his position at the top was always precarious. Now Wolsey had a major crisis to deal with, known as the King's Great Matter. Since 1509, Henry had been married to Catherine of Aragon, the widow of his older brother Arthur.
But there was a problem. After 18 years of marriage, Henry and Catherine still only had one child, a daughter, Mary. What they needed was a son. Well, we tend to think of the Tudor dynasty as all-powerful, but in fact, by now, they'd only been on the throne for 42 years, and their future hung by a thread. Henry desperately needed a male heir.
Henry had convinced himself that marrying his late brother's wife must have been against God's will. He wanted out so he could remarry, and the woman he had in his sights was one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, Anne Boleyn.
Henry tasked Wolsey with getting his marriage to Catherine annulled, and in order to do that, Wolsey had to persuade the Pope to give his permission. The trouble was, Catherine herself didn't want the marriage annulled, and she had some very influential connections.
Her nephew was Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor and the most powerful monarch in Europe. With his support, Catherine successfully appealed against the annulment to the Pope. Henry's cause now looked hopeless.
Wolsey desperately tried to solve the problem, even holding a trial at Blackfriars in 1529 to prove the illegality of Henry's marriage to Catherine.
For 2 years, the king's great matter rumbled on. But Wolsey was unable to find a way of annulling Henry's marriage. Catherine wasn't going anywhere, and Anne Boleyn taunted the king for his failure to solve the problem. She convinced him that Wolsey was in league with the Pope to deliberately slow things down.
Henry was rapidly losing faith in Wolsey, and the end came in 1529 when he suddenly had him thrown out of court, stripped of all his great titles and offices. And all those who'd served Wolsey were now tainted by association, so like rats from a sinking ship, they deserted him. All except Cromwell, and it's greatly to his credit that he stood by his master, especially as he had most to lose.
A member of Wolsey's household found Cromwell crying in a window. He said he feared he was going to lose all he had worked so hard for. He'd gone from being a Putney ruffian to the chief fixer of the king's right-hand man. But now it all looked set to come crashing down.
But Cromwell wasn't the sort of man to wallow in self-pity for very long, and we have an account here of what happened next. He said,
I do intend, God willing, this afternoon, when my lord had dined, to ride to London, and so to the court, where I will either make or mar.
He alone is willing to speak up for Wolsey.
But Cromwell couldn't save his master. Wolsey was to suffer the fate of advisors who failed to give Henry VIII what he wanted. He was summoned to the Tower of London.
But Wolsey never made it. He died on the way from ill health, perhaps brought on by the stress he'd suffered since his arrest. Well, his final recorded words could read as a warning to Cromwell. I see the matter against me, how it is framed, but if I had served God as diligently as I have done the king, he would not have given me over in my grey hairs.
Cromwell's professional life was unravelling, and so too was his personal life. His wife and his 2 young daughters contracted the sweating sickness, a terrifying illness that was sweeping through Tudor England. All of them died.
We have no record of Cromwell's reaction to their deaths, but he must have been devastated.
Cromwell had hit an all-time low, and now he had to save himself. Wolsey had fallen because of his failure to secure the annulment of the king's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. He'd tried to work within the Roman Catholic Church, and his failure cost him everything. If Cromwell were to succeed, he'd have to come up with a whole new approach.
He very quickly realised it was hopeless trying to get the Pope to grant the annulment. Instead, he had to find a way to cut him out of the equation altogether. So he sent researchers to libraries across the land to find some justification for the king's authority being higher than that of Rome. And what they come back with beggars belief.
It was a 12th century book, The History of the Kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth. It contained the legendary tale of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table.
It tells a story of King Arthur being involved in an epic struggle against the Roman Empire when one of his knights reminds him of an ancient Roman prophecy. It says,
"Someone born of British blood shall seize the empire of Rome."
So this meant that King Arthur must have been an emperor. So logically, his successor, Henry VIII, would be of the same status, and emperors were well above papal authority. But really, I find the whole thing ludicrous. The break with Rome, the religion of the entire kingdom, now rested on little more than a fairy tale.
Cromwell's job was to make this fairy tale a reality. To do this, he drafted an Act of Parliament to persuade nobles and the English people that Henry's authority really was above that of the popes.
And this is what he proposed, called the Act in Restraint of Appeals. It says, "By sundry old authentic history and chronicles, it is manifestly declared and expressed
that this realm of England is an empire, and so it has been accepted in the world, governed by one supreme head and king."
Against the odds, Cromwell succeeded in making it law. Britain was now an empire, and King Henry its emperor.
It would stop any legal appeals from England to Rome, even from Catherine of Aragon herself. This meant that she'd be unable to call on the Pope to stand in the way of the annulment of her marriage. This act changed England forever, creating a split between the King and the Pope.
This was an astounding victory for Cromwell. He had cemented his position as the king's right-hand man. The blacksmith's son had succeeded where his mentor, Cardinal Wolsey, had failed. But for Cromwell, the stakes were high. He'd witnessed firsthand the brutality of the royal court and the fate suffered by his predecessor. No doubt Cromwell remembered lessons learned 20 years earlier in Italy from the master of political manipulation, Machiavelli.
There's a very good quote in Machiavelli about the fox and the lion that captures this idea. He says,
"Since a ruler has to be able to act the beast, he should take on the traits of the fox and the lion. The lion can't defend itself against traps, and the fox can't defend itself from wolves."
So he saw that if you were going to be a successful ruler, you had to have both of those abilities. You had to have the courage to make difficult decisions and force them through, but you also had to be wily and work out how to implement them in practice.
That's really interesting because Henry VIII was once compared to a lion who didn't know his own strength, sort of didn't have the cunning, but, you know, he was this great fearsome beast, but kind of out of control, really.
Yes, and I imagine that Cromwell provided the fox-like qualities to go with this lion, to constrain him and find a way of channeling what he wanted to do.
Cromwell's fox-like qualities had made him master of the dark corridors in the Tudor court. But now he still faced a monumental challenge, getting Henry's annulment passed by the Church in England. And if he failed, he'd be banished to the Tower of London. By the 1530s, Thomas Cromwell was at the top of his game. As Henry VIII's special advisor, he'd taken back control of the churches and monasteries from Rome, and the king was now head of the church in England. After the fall of Cardinal Wolsey, the king took possession of his palace, Hampton Court. I've come to its magnificent chapel to meet the current chaplain, Father Anthony.
Well, Father Anthony, we're here in Henry VIII's splendid Chapel Royal, and he himself would have been a regular worshipper here, wouldn't he?
Yes, he would have done. He would have sat in what was called the Holy Day Closet, which is now the Royal Pew, which is the gallery at the west end of the chapel. That's where the King and Queen would come on the holy days, Sundays and the special occasions.
Father Anthony has a prized possession that shows firsthand the fundamental change in the Church of England.
So this is a rather beautiful little book from 1515. So it's the same age as the palace, actually. It's remarkable
wonderful
to think, isn't it, holding my hands here. And we have at the middle what they call the canon of the Mass. And so this is the most important part in that sense. As well as the priest saying the prayer to turn the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ, he would have prayed for various parts, the church throughout the world, the bishop, and traditionally the Pope. And so if we look here, that would have said Papa Nostra. However, it's been scored out because at the time, Henry gave a command that the name of the Pope had to be removed from all service books and replaced by his. And so you can see in the margin, Rex Henry.
Oh, yes, instead of Pope, crossed out.
The emphasis on who is the supreme head of the church has completely changed.
Cromwell had broken England from the Catholic Church because the Pope refused to annul the king's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. That should have solved the problem, but there had been another opponent to the annulment closer to home, the Archbishop of Canterbury. It looked like Cromwell would also fail to solve the king's great matter. But, as luck would have it, the Archbishop died, and Cromwell wasted no time in influencing the appointment of a more sympathetic replacement by drawing on the contacts of the Queen-in-Waiting, Anne Boleyn.
This was a masterstroke. Anne's influential family managed to secure the top job in the church for a new man, Thomas Cranmer.
Unlike his predecessor, Cranmer was a reformer and more understanding of the king's predicament.
Under considerable pressure from Cromwell, Cranmer reluctantly agreed to annul the king's marriage to Catherine.
Cromwell had succeeded in solving the king's great matter. Five days later, the king married Anne Boleyn in the private chapel at the Palace of Westminster. It was around this time that Cromwell's famous portrait was painted by the celebrated artist Hans Holbein.
It was truly one of the most meteoric rises in history, and it brought him enormous wealth and power.
Emboldened by his success, Cromwell now had plans that would change Britain forever. He had set his sights on modernising the church in England. Together with Cranmer, he drew inspiration from a religious revolution that was sweeping across Europe: the Reformation.
It was started by the German cleric Martin Luther in 1517 and overturned centuries of tradition. They called themselves evangelicals because they turned to the Gospels and sought a simpler form of Christianity without all the trappings of the Catholic faith, such as indulgences where you could buy your way into heaven, or the veneration of relics.
Relics have been central to the faith of Roman Catholics like Allegra Mutanda for centuries.
So, Allegra, what exactly are relics?
Relics are really the remains of what is left of people, and usually it refers to very holy and sacred people. What is referred to as first-class relics would be anything that might have belonged to Jesus, that was there in the life of Jesus. So it could be his manger, it could be the cross on which he was hung. So you have splinters of the cross that many churches and many places have, but also the bones of saints are considered as first-class relics.
These tiny fragments are said to be bones of saints and splinters of the cross on which Jesus was crucified.
Were relics believed to have miraculous powers?
They are, because they are known to be a grace from God, that sometimes you can touch a relic or you can pray at the tomb of a saint and be miraculously healed or transformed in your life.
Reformers like Cromwell wanted to eradicate relics from the church, but he faced a monumental challenge. Relics were the prized possessions of England's richest landowners, the monasteries. One of the most celebrated was said to be from Jesus himself and was the prized possession of Hales Abbey in Gloucestershire. Professor James Clark is an expert on the monasteries of England.
So, James, it's quite hard to imagine today, but Hales was an abbey of some status, wasn't it?
Hugely. It claims to hold the relic of the blood of Jesus Christ.
Wow, you don't get much better than that. And presumably they flocked here in great numbers then to see it.
Yes, so they come in to the nave of the church and then probably through an iron gate where they'll have to pay a penny or two to be let in. So here we would have seen the hugely elaborate setting of this relic. We have an image from a pamphlet from the early 16th century, and we have a representation of what it might have looked like. Right at the heart, picked out in red, is the relic itself.
So really it's the equivalent of queuing to see the Mona Lisa or the crown jewels?
Yes, absolutely. After all that anticipation, you're looking over somebody's shoulder because people are in awe of this.
And then the monasteries really do the classic thing of making people exit through the gift shop.
Oh yes, absolutely. They want you to part with your money.
The combined wealth of the monasteries was at least 3 times that of the king. When Cromwell entered the service of Henry VIII, he had promised to make the king the richest sovereign who ever reigned in England. Now, through the Reformation, he saw a way of acquiring that wealth. Cromwell planned to dissolve Hales Abbey, seizing its income and disposing of its assets. The way to do that was to discredit the relic of Christ's blood by proving it was a fake.
They do examine the phial that the blood was contained in, and what they say in the report is that it looked red only because of the glass that covered it, and when they removed that, it actually looked a sort of dirty gold colour.
So that's the end of Hales's crown jewels, so to speak.
Yes, it is.
With their relic discredited, the abbot surrendered. Cromwell's men destroyed the buildings, seized their assets and land, and transferred the wealth to the king's coffers. He had begun to make good on his promise to make Henry the richest ever king of England. He'd begun by dissolving small religious houses. Buoyed by the success, he moved on to the larger and richer ones. First, he had to conduct an audit of over 900 monasteries. The project was known as the Valor Ecclesiasticus, or church valuation. I've come to the National Archives to see one of the original inventories. Head of Medieval Research Sean Cunningham has been studying this magnificent document.
Oh, wow! That's absolutely stunning. I've never seen this before.
Yes, this is one of 2 books of transcriptions made for Henry himself.
It's not just a boring old account book. How was the information gathered?
Cromwell is sending out his team of men to actually go and visit monasteries, to look at the accounts and the income.
For centuries, monasteries had earned income from charging pilgrims to see holy relics and renting out land and property. Whalley Abbey in Lancashire was typical of many.
These are different types of income. So they're separating rents from manors and estates, but the total for money coming in is about £551.
The inventory goes into forensic detail, counting church income right down to the penny.
All the tiny little places that are paying rent to the abbey here, £3 or £4, some of them are paying 50 shillings, the one's paying 12 pence.
Cromwell now knew the worth of every monastery in the land, but he suspected that closing them would be deeply unpopular. He needed to justify his actions. So he sent agents to investigate claims of corruption. If he could prove there was wrongdoing, he'd have an excuse to shut them down. One agent, Richard Leighton, made shocking allegations about monks in the city of Bath.
He's talking here about how many women the monks of Bath are keeping, and how there's young boys as well. And there's evidence, as he's seen it, of buggery and fornication going on in the abbey.
This is absolutely scandalous stuff, isn't it? I mean, it goes far beyond just a bit of corruption.
Whether it's absolutely the truth or just what Cromwell wants to hear, you get a sense that, well, it's justifying the process that's already underway. It's really a damning portrait of the whole monastic community.
Cromwell was a cunning politician, and he'd used his skills to construct a convincing case against the monasteries. Now he could begin seizing their vast wealth. He was determined to destroy them and would let no one stand in his way, not even the Queen herself. He was about to commit his bloodiest act so far. It's spring 1536. Thomas Cromwell is revolutionising England's religious life, selling off church land to swell the royal coffers. But he is about to face serious opposition from a dangerous enemy, Queen Anne Boleyn herself.
Anne and Cromwell were both reformers, but they disagreed over where the money from the dissolved monasteries should go to. Anne argued that it should be diverted to charitable causes and education, whereas Cromwell strongly believed it should go straight to the king. Anne now accused him of outright corruption.
Just 2 years earlier, Cromwell had enabled her to become queen. But 2 years was a long time in Henry's court. Anne Boleyn, once untouchable, was now vulnerable. Henry hoped Anne would give him a male heir, but she suffered a miscarriage, and it was a boy.
It dawned on Henry that Anne wasn't going to give him the son he so desperately needed, and he tired of her as a wife too. He wanted out.
For Cromwell, the Queen's misfortune was an opportunity not to be missed. He seized on the King's resentment towards his wife and began plotting her downfall.
He quietly began questioning Anne's ladies, gathering evidence, before eventually bringing a very shocking accusation of adultery against the Queen with not just one, but 5 men.
He even claimed that she committed incest with her own brother. But most damning of all was the charge that Anne and her lovers had plotted to kill the king. This was treason, punishable by death. The allegations were almost certainly untrue, but being a trained lawyer, he made sure the case was watertight.
When Henry was told of this, he was distraught and wept. It was undoubtedly Cromwell's most ruthless act.
Cromwell now moved with bewildering speed. On the 2nd of May 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. She was tried and found guilty. Just 17 days later, Cromwell was among the witnesses who gathered to see the Queen beheaded. He had pulled off a masterstroke, eliminating his most dangerous enemy and once again proving his worth to the king. The next day, the king was betrothed to a former lady-in-waiting to his dead wife, Jane Seymour.
Cromwell knew full well that Anne Boleyn was guilty of nothing more than flirtation. Why would she risk adultery when she'd fought so hard to be queen? But that didn't matter. What mattered to Cromwell was getting her out of the way. Well, I think you can forgive him for many of the crimes of which he's been accused over the years, but not this one.
Cromwell had taken a huge risk by removing Anne, and it had paid off. But now he faced a new threat. In towns and villages across the kingdom, people were furious at the abolition of their local monasteries. This dissolution of the monasteries was unpopular in the wider country. Monasteries played a vital role in local communities. They provided jobs and education, charity for the poor, and help for the sick. For many, the attack on monasteries was an attack on their way of life.
The first major rebellion against the religious changes was here in Lincolnshire. There was a huge upsurge of opposition that broke out, and soon thousands of rebels marched here on Lincoln.
The focus of their anger was the Bishop of Lincoln, a supporter of Cromwell's reforms.
They marched from the castle just across the square and onto the cathedral. Of course, it was hugely symbolic. They soon overran it. They ousted the hated Bishop of Lincoln, and really their triumph was complete.
The bishop escaped unharmed, but the protesters had sent a message to the king. The people of Lincoln, one of the kingdom's most important cities, wanted nothing to do with Cromwell's reforms.
The rumour was that the parish churches were going to be attacked, and the crosses and the chalices were going to be taken away, that processions and maybe the Eucharist would become impossible, and that therefore the saving grace of the church would be undermined. It was not true that the parish churches were going to be touched, but it was a believable rumour, absolutely.
There's clearly a lot of opposition to the dissolution here in Lincoln. But what about Cromwell himself? What do people think of him?
They plainly hated him. And from the position of the monarchy, anything that smacks of rebellion is absolutely unacceptable. Even a relatively small demonstration is a real threat. It showed that he was not well liked, but there is a theory that Henry knew it is good to have some advisors who are not well liked. If something does not go well, you can sacrifice them.
The disorder threatened to spark a full-scale revolution. 30,000 men took up arms across northern England in what became known as the Pilgrimage of Grace. Cromwell was not just the focus of hatred among ordinary people. He was also despised by rivals who resented his influence on the king, especially the Duke of Norfolk. Norfolk was one of the court's longest-serving members, a proud, arrogant man, famed for his explosive temperament. He'd nicknamed Cromwell the blacksmith's boy, a mocking reference to his humble beginnings.
Nobles such as Norfolk deeply resented Cromwell's power, the fact that he was so close to the king. They thought he had no business being in great palaces such as this. Well, it's tempting to think that it was because Cromwell now had so much authority that he was very confident around the king. But actually, he'd always been like that. He'd never been intimidated by figures of authority.
But Cromwell relied on the king for his status. Without Henry's favour, he was nothing, and Norfolk knew it. He believed the king would blame Cromwell for the unrest, and if he did, Cromwell would be finished. But the king stood by his man, telling him,
"The country does not know thee as I know thee. Whoever harms thee shall harm me."
Cromwell had weathered the rebellion, and his influence on Henry seemed as strong as ever. He wasted no time using his powers to further his own agenda. Henry had no interest in administration, so Cromwell increasingly controlled every aspect of government.
He made these very, very comprehensive lists of things that he wanted to deal with when talking to Henry. You can see at the top it says, "Remembrances at my next going to the court."
These remembrances are his to-do lists, each one an area of policy he wished to discuss with the king.
And what these remembrances really get across is just the vast knowledge that Cromwell had of every single aspect of government. Yes, he was a lawyer and a merchant, but he knew about everything else as well. Trade, industry, agriculture. It's all in here.
But as well as being an expert in creating wealth for the king, Cromwell also had another totally different side to him. He was a social reformer with a genuine interest in helping the poor. Every day he provided food for the city's deprived outside his home in Austin Friars. Yet he wanted to do more, so he drafted Acts of Parliament to help those at the bottom of society.
You can see here the beginnings of a modern-day welfare state. His ideas encompassed everything from dealing with the sick and injured, the beginnings of some kind of national health service, to job creation, apprenticeships, even a minimum wage. Cromwell's vision really sets him in a very different light to that ruthless schemer who's much more familiar from the history books. It makes me like him an awful lot more. He never forgets where he came from, and he wants to help people who are still at the very bottom of society.
Cromwell's complete mastery of government policy and his tireless work ethic had made him invaluable to Henry VIII. Now he was about to be rewarded with something money couldn't buy. This is St George's Chapel in Windsor Castle.
And it became familiar territory to Cromwell in 1537, when Henry invited him to become a Knight of the Garter. This was a huge honour, restricted just to 24 people, even to this day, all of whom are personally selected by the King or Queen. What must Cromwell have thought when he was given this extraordinary honour? He'd gone from being the blacksmith's boy in Putney to being elevated to the greatest honour in the kingdom.
And what must the other Garter Knights have thought about this overconfident commoner suddenly in their midst? They must have been seething with anger. As long as Cromwell served the king, he was safe, no matter what opposition he faced from the nobles. But he was about to be tested like never before, when tragedy struck the royal court. It's autumn 1537. Thomas Cromwell has faced down rebellion and opposition at court over the dissolution of England's monasteries. But he has managed to keep in favour with the king by helping to dispose of his second wife, Anne Boleyn, when she failed to produce a male heir. Now Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, is pregnant with what everyone hopes is a boy. On the 12th of October, Jane gave birth to a boy, the future King Edward VI. Finally, Henry had the male heir he longed for. There were celebrations across the kingdom. Bonfires were lit and cannons were fired. But then, tragedy struck.
Jane never recovered from the birth. It's likely she contracted an infection, possibly due to the poor hygiene in her bedchamber. Well, Cromwell was quick to express an opinion on the matter. He wrote,
"It was the fault of them that were about her, which made her to take great cold, and to eat things that her fantasy and sickness called for."
Well, Cromwell knew that Henry, in his grief, would soon be looking for someone to blame, and he wanted to make very sure it wasn't him.
Cromwell had already arranged a royal divorce, a marriage and an execution. Now he took it upon himself to find Henry a fourth wife.
But being Cromwell, he also had his own agenda. He wanted a wife for Henry who would ally England with the supporters of the Reformation, and he thought he'd found the ideal candidate.
She was a 24-year-old German princess, Anne of Cleves. If Henry married her, it would cement the Reformation by allying England with a Protestant power. For Cromwell, this was a diplomatic move. But first, he had to persuade Henry to marry a woman he'd never met.
This is a portrait of Anne, and it's typical of other portraits of the time which show the person facing slightly to the side. But this isn't the painting that Henry first saw.
To get the king's approval, Cromwell dispatched the celebrated artist Hans Holbein to Germany to paint Anne.
What's notable is Anne is staring straight ahead. Now that's deliberate, apparently so that she couldn't hide any blemishes. And she's also wearing an English headdress so that Henry could compare her to the ladies of his own court.
The portrait persuaded Henry of Anne's beauty, and he agreed to the match. Now she had to embark on what would be a 2-month journey to England. Cromwell had used his talent as a masterful spin doctor to arrange the king's marriage. For his next mission, he'd have to again draw on all his skills of diplomacy. He planned to distribute copies of the Bible in English to every church. The Bible had always been written in Latin, so most worshippers couldn't question its contents. But committed reformers like Cromwell believed that ordinary people should understand the word of God. He also hoped it would promote loyalty to Henry as head of the church. Here at Cambridge University Library, they have an original copy.
Wow.
This is the Great Bible.
It's amazing.
You can try to lift it up. You feel it's quite a heavy book.
It's really heavy.
Historian Dr. Eyal Poleg is doing brand new research into its origins.
So this was Cromwell's great work?
Indeed. And he was very invested in this book. It's the first time a Bible in English, or actually a Bible at all, is distributed across England.
While a Bible in English may seem innocuous today, in Tudor England it was radical and potentially dangerous, particularly to a religiously conservative king. To appease Henry, Cromwell commissioned an elaborate title page with the king at its centre.
You can see it very clearly here that you have Henry, very majestic at the top of the page.
So the Bible seeps not from God, but from Henry as the fountain of all knowledge.
And you can see God just above Henry's head, but he's much smaller than the king.
Henry is literally about 4 times bigger than God in this image. The page was made to appeal to Henry.
The king is seen handing the new Bible to 2 figures. One represents the congregation, the other the clergy. Further down the page, Cromwell himself distributes copies to the people. It was a masterful piece of propaganda for Henry, not to mention shameless self-promotion by Cromwell.
We actually have here the image of the title page from one of the presentation copies.
Glorious Technicolor. That's amazing.
Black and white prints were produced for churches across the land, but there were also 2 colour copies, one for Cromwell and one for Henry. He hoped this would sell the idea of an English Bible to a sceptical king.
This was hand-coloured. So at first they printed the image on parchment, and then they gave it to artists to colour.
It has always been assumed that the colour and black and white versions are identical in content. But when Eyal studied them in more detail, he noticed some intriguing differences.
I could see some of the changes there, but you cannot appreciate all of them with the naked eye. So in order to understand that, I realized I needed some help.
Eyal enlisted the help of Dr. Paola Ricciardi from the Fitzwilliam Museum. She used an X-ray machine and a digital microscope to analyse the colour title page of Henry's Bible in forensic detail. Paola made a startling discovery. 2 of the faces had been altered after the colouring process. Firstly, the anonymous man receiving the Bible from Henry had been replaced by Cromwell himself.
We started looking very close to the plane of the page, and as soon as you do that, you see something really interesting, really different. You can see there's an edge now to the image.
Yes, very clearly.
And this actually tells us that this portrait of Cromwell was painted on a separate piece of parchment and then stuck onto the page. Yes.
Absolutely fascinating. You can see very clearly there just the line of where it's been pasted on.
Further down the page is the second alteration. In the black and white print, the person giving out the Bible is clearly Cromwell. But in the colour version, it's someone else.
You can see from the portrait that they're remarkably different.
Yes, it doesn't look anything like him, really.
Yes.
In costume, yes, but in facial features, not at all.
It's been done so professionally that people have been looking at this image for centuries without seeing that modification.
Really see very clearly the edge here.
That's absolutely incredible. It's airbrushing here of history.
Cromwell is no longer proudly giving out Bibles to the congregation. Instead, he's humbly receiving a Bible from the king.
You can really see Cromwell's thought process here. Between the production of the Bible, the first printing, and the colouring and repasting, you can see he's becoming more hesitant about Henry's acceptance of the Bible.
The Tudor court was a dangerous place, and Cromwell was always looking over his shoulder.
It shows just how insecure he's feeling with the king at this time.
But as long as Cromwell continued to create enormous wealth for the king, he was indispensable. By 1539, Cromwell's men had dissolved over 600 monasteries. Now, only a few remained. One of the most iconic was Glastonbury Abbey in Somerset. Founded in the 7th century, it claimed to be the most ancient monastery in the kingdom. Professor James Clark of Exeter University is giving me a tour.
Even now, much decayed, it's a very impressive ruin. Can you locate us? Where exactly in the Abbey are we standing now?
Well, now we're in the very heart of the Abbey Church. We are at the high altar, the very focal point of the monks' worship in the Abbey.
In Cromwell's day, this was one of the wealthiest abbeys in the kingdom and a major landowner in the county of Somerset.
Seeing Glastonbury Abbey through Cromwell's eyes, there's no greater prize, is there? Not just for its wealth, but its symbolic importance.
Yes, that's right. In many ways, dissolving Glastonbury Abbey is really like the project of the dissolution of the monasteries as a whole in microcosm.
How did it fall foul of the dissolution?
By 1539, suspicion is mounting in Cromwell's mind that the abbot is perhaps beginning to let out some of his great portfolio of property in case the crown should come to grasp it. And so he sends his commissioners down here to Somerset to investigate exactly what's going on.
When Cromwell's men searched the abbey, they claimed to have discovered huge quantities of treasure which the monks had hidden.
There are plenty of niches and alcoves where you could tuck something behind, hangings, painted panels.
They reported their findings to Cromwell.
We have a very good account of what they do and what they find. They claim that they have found, buried out, both money and plate hidden, mirrored up in walls. In other words, that they have found decorative objects, valuable items that have been secreted away in all kinds of spaces. This is some wonderful Tudor spelling. The abbot and the monks have embirtled, which probably means embezzled, and stolen as much plate and ornaments as to have begun a new abbey.
The monks had been caught red-handed. Their elderly abbot, Richard Whiting, was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. Cromwell, determined to make an example of him, took personal charge of his interrogation. Whiting was charged with hiding treasure and possession of literature claiming the Pope, not Henry, was head of the church. He was taken to the Bishop's Palace in Wells and tried. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Guilty. The next day, Richard Whiting and two of his monks suffered a shockingly brutal fate.
Well, I've seen photographs of Glastonbury Tor many times, but this is the first time I've been here. And it's only when you climb up it that you realise just how steep it is.
The three men were tied to hurdles and dragged by horses up the steep hillside.
I think for the crowd of onlookers, the spectacle of this man who has been at the heart of their community being cruelly treated in this way would have been quite horrific.
They couldn't have done it in a more public manner. I mean, he could be seen for miles around.
Yes, absolutely, and we know that Cromwell relishes political theatre, and a performance of punishment in this way would have resounded across the whole region.
At the summit, the men suffered the horror of a traitor's death. They were hung, drawn and quartered. The bloody scene played out in full view of the abbey and the town of Glastonbury below.
It's hard not to see that it is a deliberate scene that he has staged here. The elderly holy man executed with men convicted of thievery either side on a hill outside a town. There's an echo of the crucifixion itself.
So it very soon became legendary.
And it reinforces that view of Henry wickedly grasping the church's wealth and Cromwell, his evil genius, Cromwell coordinating and masterminding this whole wicked plan.
This wasn't the first time Cromwell had sent an enemy to their death. But this execution was different. It was a warning to anyone who dared question his or the king's authority. Cromwell was not afraid to practice what he'd learned from Machiavelli 30 years earlier. It was better to be feared than loved. As the 1530s drew to a close, Cromwell's plans were falling into place, including the king's imminent marriage to the German princess Anne of Cleves. But this time, Cromwell had got it horribly wrong. It's New Year's Day 1540. Cromwell is overseeing preparations for Henry VIII's fourth wedding. The 48-year-old king is about to marry a German princess half his age, Anne of Cleves. Cromwell chose Anne for Henry, but the king is yet to be introduced to her. A lavish ceremony had been arranged for their first meeting, but the king couldn't wait.
So Henry rushed to meet Anne 3 days early, and as soon as he burst into her chamber and saw her for the first time, he was utterly appalled.
She was big-boned and had a large nose, cleverly disguised by the angle of Holbein's portrait. Henry complained,
"She is nothing fair, and her very evil smells about her."
Not only did he find her deeply unattractive, but he was also disgusted by her lack of courtly refinements. As soon as he was back in London, he rounded on Cromwell, shouting, "I like her not."
Henry commanded his lawyers to annul their marriage. Despite the fiasco, the king forgave Cromwell, but his influence was diminished. For once, he had badly misjudged what Henry wanted, and his failure must have emboldened his enemies at court. None more so than the Duke of Norfolk. But Cromwell was about to make an even more dangerous mistake, one that would fan the flames of their long-standing and bitter rivalry.
By the beginning of 1540, the rivalry between Cromwell and Norfolk had reached fever pitch, and it centred on Thetford Priory, an ancient monastery in Norfolk which had strong associations with the Duke's family.
Many of the Duke's ancestors were buried here, and he'd worked tirelessly to have the monastery spared from Cromwell's religious reforms.
But Cromwell was equally determined to see it destroyed.
On the 16th of February 1540, the priory surrendered to Cromwell's men. Norfolk faced the indignity of exhuming his ancestors' remains before the priory was torn down.
Cromwell must have known the risks involved in taking such a deliberately aggressive step against his rival.
Norfolk's humiliation was compounded when just a few weeks later, the king bestowed the title Earl of Essex upon Cromwell. It was too much for Norfolk to bear. Then, an opportunity to take down the blacksmith's boy fell into his lap. Cromwell was taken ill and was away from court for a few days. Norfolk seized his chance.
Norfolk's supporters spread rumours about what they claimed was Cromwell's true goal. It was said that Cromwell had ambitions beyond being the king's trusted advisor, and that he had designs on the throne.
One courtier even claimed he'd heard Cromwell say he hoped one day to be king.
The Duke accused Cromwell of heresy because of his radical religious beliefs, and he also claimed that he was plotting to marry the king's eldest daughter, Mary, in order to bolster his claim to the throne. Well, this was the most shocking allegation of all, and it was also a malicious lie, but Henry chose to believe every word. Cromwell was branded a heretic and a traitor.
Cromwell had fallen foul of the same trick he'd used to do away with Anne Boleyn, charges of treason based on nothing more than a rumour. This was how the Tudor court worked. A plot gained momentum, and by the time the victim knew they were in danger, it was too late. Norfolk chose to strike at a meeting of the King's Council. As soon as Cromwell entered the chamber, he was arrested.
Cromwell's first reaction is one of utter fury, and this is when his mortal enemy, the Duke of Norfolk, has his moment. He steps forward, he rips the Order of St. George from around Cromwell's neck. He's stripping him of all his great titles and reducing him to his true origins. Cromwell is bundled into a waiting barge and taken from Westminster, the ominously short journey to the Tower of London.
Cromwell had always known the king could turn on those he held closest, and he'd spent years making sure it wouldn't happen to him. But this time, he'd been outplayed by Norfolk.
Cromwell must have been utterly bewildered, furious, certainly. He always prided himself on being well informed, but he didn't know this was coming.
From the Tower, Cromwell wrote one final letter begging Henry to save him.
When you see the original of his letter, you sense his desperation. He really is writing for his life. He says, "There is nothing earthly that I more covet than
the security of your royal person and the wealth of your realm."
He's assuring Henry of his devout, unflinching loyalty. He says he's much grieved at being accused of treachery and reminds Henry of everything he's done for him over the past decade. The sheer terror he must have felt is also painfully obvious. He refers to the shedding of my blood and begs the king upon my knees to pardon him. But there's a postscript. Cromwell doesn't think he's quite done enough. So at the end of the letter, he writes, "Most gracious prince,
I cry for mercy. Mercy. Mercy."
And he signs the letter, Thomas Cromwell.
But his pleas were in vain. Henry had made up his mind. On the 28th of July, he sent Cromwell to the scaffold. He was to be beheaded.
Cromwell was led from the Tower, the short walk towards Tower Hill. Well, thousands of people would have been crowded here to witness his final moments. And it was reported that there were no fewer than 1,000 guards to accompany him because he was so popular with the common people that civil unrest was feared. As he reached the spot where the scaffold was, he turned to the axeman and said, "Pray, if possible, strike off my head with one blow so that I may not suffer." Well, his plea would not be answered.
It was claimed that Norfolk, in a final act of hatred, bribed the executioner to prolong Cromwell's agony. It took at least 3 blows to sever his head. He was buried in the Tower of London Chapel, just a few feet from Anne Boleyn, the queen he'd conspired to execute.
The king had made a great show of caring nothing for Cromwell's death. He'd chosen the very same day as his execution to marry again to wife number 5, Catherine Howard. But it wasn't long before regret set in. And within just a few short weeks of Cromwell's execution, Henry was heard to lament the loss of the most faithful servant he'd ever had.
There's no doubt that Cromwell committed some truly terrible acts in the service of the king and his own personal ambition. But I think there's more to him than that.
I see Cromwell as an outsider, a disruptor. He'd overhauled the entire religious and political establishment of England. He never forgot his background, and he stood up for people who couldn't defend themselves. I would have loved to have met Cromwell, to have found out just what made him tick. Get an insight into his brilliant mind, his enormous capacity for hard work and political manoeuvrings. Would I have liked him? I'm not sure, but I certainly would have admired him.
UK Coast Guard. Hi, I've got a call coming at Seven Sisters. 3 people have walked along and now the tide's coming in. They're trapped.
Time and tide was against us.
I thought, I'm going to die.
Catch Coast Guard Search and Rescue SOS brand new tonight at 9. Next, 5 News.